Hello and welcome to episode 27 of the Wilder podcast. This week we speak to Duncan Fisher, one of the founders of Our Food 1200. Throughout the interview we explore their vision for a new decentralised small-scale farming system, making farming accessible to all. Chloe, hello.
Good evening.
Now I'm going to start with a stat.
I'm ready.
Did you know in the last 28 days we have been listened to and downloaded in 31 countries worldwide?
I'm mostly impressed.
Mostly impressed. Do you expect better? I'm sorry that I'm letting you down here. Like what?
I mean, I just can't imagine who's listening to us in 31 countries, I have to say.
The vast majority, 77% or so, is the UK, which is unsurprising. But, I mean, we have 20 downloads in Bahrain. So welcome to a listener there, or two listeners. It's great.
Welcome, Bahrain.
Yes. Anyway, if you're new to the podcast, welcome. We are a podcast all about rewilding and exploring sustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss, and a whole bunch of other topics, while at the same time rewilding our small site here in rural Monmouthshire. And as we didn't really know anything at the start of this podcast, we're really learning as we go along and listening and speaking to some fascinating people. So thank you for joining us on the journey. What we normally do at the start of each podcast is give a very short update on what we're doing on the Grange project. So that's our own rewilding project. So Chloe, would you like to give us some information? What's going on?
So the key event of the last 2 weeks was our second ever community day.
Yeah.
So we were joined by a lovely group, some familiar faces and some new faces, and we got stuck into a range of different activities. I think my favourite moment was during the butterfly transect, which Ranger Jerry kind of organised for us. And I was standing by the barn and all I could hear around me echoing off the land was Meadow Brown, Meadow Brown, Meadow Brown. And
there were some small white, large whites or whatever they were. And
come on, Tom, small whites. Yeah.
And there was the other one.
It's lucky we weren't relying on you for the butterfly identification.
No, I was too busy flying my drone around and just...
But do you want some stats from the butterfly transects? Okay, so there are 11 species recorded in total with an overall tally of 636. We did spot 425 meadow browns, so they were a popular one. But gatekeepers, ringlets, green veined whites, and a number of others, which I'm not going to go through in detail. But thank you so much for everyone's energy and the kind of positivity that people brought to that and all the other activities that we were doing during the day.
Yeah, it was just laughter as well that kind of came through. And the pigs, I like to say played a cameo, but actually they were just there all day, just snuffling around, which was great. The thing I do want to say about butterflies and why it's so important to baseline our butterflies right now is because they're a key indicator of the health of the land. If the butterfly community, population drops, then clearly there's something negative or bad happening. They're one of the first to be affected by something negative happening in a habitat. And vice versa, if you're having a positive impact, they're one of the first to have abundance. And therefore we can really track the impact we're having on the land. So that's why, butterflies are key.
Having just done a little bit of brief education from Jerry on butterflies, now when I'm walking through the land, it's just given me a different relationship to the butterflies in terms of understanding the role they're playing, but also having some poor identification skills does change your experience in a positive way.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on butterflies is that obviously caterpillars are key food for chicks as they are obviously growing. And Ranger Jerry said that it takes something like 80 to 100 caterpillars a day to feed a chick. So you need caterpillars, you equally need butterflies to survive and feed the population of the birds, which then go on to feed on other things as well. So it's, really cool and how everything's interlinked and how much abundance you require just to sustain a decent, healthy population of other animals. So to summarise, it was a really positive day. Lots of things were done, not just counting butterflies, lots of kind of manual labour, removing fence lines and repurposing green hay across onto our invertebrate mounds. Again, all positive stuff. So last update before we go into a great interview, but I don't want to start talking about that now, otherwise I won't stop. So we have another pretty good announcement coming up. Chloe, would you like to announce it as you did all of the hard work and tapping away at the keyboard to apply for this?
Yeah, so we're super delighted to announce that we've been awarded our first grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which is for a tiny forest.
Yeah, and the cool thing about that is we are now a signed up member of the National Forest for Wales because we're now having this tiny forest. Now, for those that may not know what a tiny forest is, Chloe, can you please elaborate?
As the name would suggest, pretty small. So it's about the size of a tennis court, about 200 square metres. But the cool thing about it is it's planted using a special Japanese method called the Miyawaki method, which is essentially a combination of doing some soil testing, so you know exactly the compaction levels of the soil, the pH levels, what nutrients it might be missing, And the density of planting enables this micro habitat to grow really quickly. And the exciting thing is that this forest is going to form the basis for our outdoor classroom, which will be in the centre of the school's field.
And the key thing of this whole project is community outreach, working with local schools, getting them involved in the planning and the planting. And it's exactly what we're trying to achieve with the Grange project. So it's super exciting. And because of the method, it grows so quickly that within 2 years, maybe 3, it'll be taller than our heads. So this outdoor classroom is instantly, very quickly going to feel very encapsulating, very special. And there's a lot of citizen science that happens. And there's also this forest, where it's planted, although it's super dense, it has 3 levels of canopies essentially within that as it grows.
I can't wait. My inner geek is getting me very excited about all the data we get to collect and analyse, even to the level of what tree species we're getting to use. And that's taken from data around the closest ancient forest near to here. And yeah, it's super exciting because it'll also be a seed source for the field. So hopefully then will cause other trees to naturally regenerate around the tiny forest.
Okay, let's step into the chat with Duncan now. It's really is up there with one of my favourite conversations we've had to date. He's a great, very knowledgeable, very passionate about what he's doing. And I truly believe that any of the listeners for the Wild Podcast is going to get something from this. And by the end of it, probably be quite inspired by it.
And I love this chat with Duncan because it was such an opportunity to educate ourselves about both the kind of challenges and opportunities of fruit production.
Here it is. Duncan, welcome to the Wilder Podcast. Now, you and I have chatted a number of times. Mainly, one of the good reasons is because you're fairly close to us down here in South Wales, and you do some really exciting stuff. And it's great we've managed to find that time to have the chat and learn about what you're doing. And I am extremely confident that a good chunk of the listeners will find what you're about to say pretty fascinating and exciting. So thank you. And would you mind just introducing yourself, give us a little bit about your background and how you find yourself to be the director over at Our Food 1200?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on your podcast. So I'm a director of Our Food 1200. I helped set it up to expand local farming in the region of Powys and the Bannabrycheiniog National Park. I got into food some years ago because my daughter set up a little food business. And so I got quite interested in how young people can get involved in this business. And that kind of took over my life gradually. And now I'm helping to build new farms in this region. That's basically how I got into it. I have no background in this field, but it was just, I can build things and make things happen. So I just got involved in this.
Yeah, but I think a man after our own heart was saying that we don't all, we're learning as we go along as well.
Exactly.
I can't move on from this question before I just quickly come back to ask, what food business was your daughter doing and what age was she?
I think she was about 12 or 13. It was eggs, but it was multicoloured eggs.
Right.
So she had 6 varieties of chicken and every one of them had a different colour egg, and they completely trashed everything around our house. I mean, it was just carnage, but she sold every egg that she got. She wouldn't give us any. She sold us eggs too. She financed it all herself. She started by offering to sell the trampoline in the garden to the neighbours to finance the chicken fencing. So she did that, and, not for too long. And then she did help after that. We set up a website around young people getting into farming, and she helped with that. But we've moved on rather a long way from there since. But that's basically what got me into this.
I mean, that is beautiful entrepreneurial flair and building that need and USP on a product. I'm just loving that at such an early age. Let's go back to the main effort for today. Could you give us an overview of Our Food 1200 and also what inspired you and the wider kind of founders to get together to start it?
Right. So we live in a rural area and there is masses of farmland around us. But if you look at it, you don't actually see much food growing on it. And there's a lot of grass, and sometimes the grass has sheep on it. And there are very few people also in the region, just very few people living here or working here. Mm-hmm. And that's because of a farming system that's existed since the Second World War, basically, which has made farms get bigger, and it's made them specialise so that they employ far fewer people. And so the whole local farming system, growing for local markets, has kind of almost completely disappeared. The future requires us to have more diverse local growing is a very important part of the future for our future security. So we said, right, we'll start getting land and getting young people on it. So we started with one approach, which was to approach farmers and say, will you make some of your land available? And we got quite a few farmers, I think, 15 or so. And then we advertised that land to people who want to start small-scale farming. We got a great response. And then we started trying to match them, and it completely fell apart. I mean, we had not a single match. It didn't work, even remotely. It was all based on one farm that did work. But what we learned from that was that farm was an absolute one-off with particular personalities involved. So we had to completely start again. And the issue is, quite simply, it's very difficult for a landowner to have someone live on their land and farm on it. It's just complicated in so many different ways that it ends up being a very niche thing that some farmers can do, some landowners can do, but the vast majority can't. So it can't be scaled. The only way is actually if you own the land, where the farmers coming onto the land can have security. They can feel that they can build a life on it. The second thing is that the farms that are around here that are available to buy are large and expensive, and the vast majority of people can't afford that. So it has to be possible for them to buy something small. And the good thing is that the kind of local farming for local markets tends to be small. So it's the right size for the market opportunity. Does that make sense? So we came up with this sort of idea of we call the affordable farm, which is a smaller farm, like 5 acres, with a house that is appropriate for a small family, a young family, because generally the people who want to farm are young and either planning to have children or already have young children. That's the general demographics, not exclusive. That's basically it. So that's basically what we had to do. We had to start saying, okay, well, we need to build new farms, small farms.
And when we had our previous conversation off air, when you elaborate on what you've just described there, I'm just really excited for, like I say, a lot of people we speak to on a fairly regular basis. But before we jump into that in more detail, do you mind if I just step you back one step? And I just want to go back to the kind of the so what, the reason why you did this, and wonderful if you could elaborate on, for me, my military background, it's always, what's the so what? What's the worst case scenario? What do we have to prepare for? Now in the military, it is always the troop of 4 T-90 Russian tanks coming over the hill. That was always the so what. That was always the risk that was happening. But it sounds like in this, the so what is food security. And what we mean by that is if X, Y, Z happen, there's a risk that we may not be able to feed ourselves. But would you mind just elaborating on that and why you think it is a concern and something we should be preparing for?
Yeah, absolutely. So our food supply is not secure. There are basically a number of pretty big risks. The first one is war. It's already happening. The Red Sea trade route is severely compromised. It looks like it's going to get a lot worse. We had Ukraine and the impact of that. Also climate change. The fact is that a lot of our food is being grown in places where it won't be able to be grown for that much longer, south of Spain, and they will sell to other countries before they sell to us. So we've got some pretty major security risks. They're not food risks, they're just security risks. We're also really weak in response to them. So, for example, we have very tight, just-in-time supply chains. There's no slack in the system. There's no stocks anywhere in the system. Most of the food, if it's not in the supermarket, is in a lorry, and that is very vulnerable. It's controlled by a handful of satellites. The food that comes into the country comes into a handful of ports. So we're really exposed. And there's a lot of interest in the defence community in London in this, and they have just commissioned a major report on this, which is being written by Professor Tim Lang, and he's submitting it today, actually. Anyway, but that will soon be published, but it's massive, and he sets out a whole set of actions that have to take place in order to protect us from that, and they fall into sort of 2 categories. One is diversify supply. We've got to get our food from a lot of different places, not just one, not just the supermarkets, because at some point, any part of that system could fall. We can't be dependent on it. And second, we've got to protect families, particularly the less well-off families, from the extreme price rises that happen every time there's a food shortage. And we've experienced all of this, all of us, in the last 3 years. Food shortages and incredibly high price rises. So the future, from a purely security point of view, is this country's major vulnerability is the ability for an enemy to undermine our food supply and cause complete and instant chaos. So that's the sort of security argument. There are other arguments. Obviously, as the kind of farming that we're promoting is smaller scale, it's agroecological. So it's very much fixing carbon in the soil. It's not using chemicals and not putting chemicals into the rivers. It's also reviving the local economy because it's bringing people in, it's creating more jobs. The kind of farming we're promoting will employ about one person per acre.
That's great.
And it generates about, well, we calculated this, it generates 151 times more value per acre than the average for Welsh farming. But that means you've got to have one person living near each acre, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And all the housing is gone. There's no housing for those people. And the planning system makes it almost impossible. But basically, that's what we've got to do. So that's the sort of food security angle, if you like. And it's a big thing.
Absolutely huge. And I think you've articulated that really well. And I thank you for that. And it's interesting you said about the houses are gone. People will think, well, no, it's rural areas. There were never many houses. And actually, that's just not true. If you look at, we've got the map of the local area here, and you can see all the cottage farm or whatever it might be marked on the map. And you go there and they're just derelict buildings, or they've been knocked down because they couldn't be maintained by the farmer, or they didn't need them anymore. And therefore they wanted to knock down and use the stones somewhere else. So there did used to be numerous accommodations for workers.
Yes, exactly. And also a lot more people living in each house. I mean, farmer houses are traditionally quite big because they were built for multi-generational families. So basically, a lot of accommodations also gone to Airbnbs, to people wanting to live in bigger houses in the countryside who don't want to farm. And both of those have driven up the price to be unaffordable to a lot of people. So we've got to kind of work around all of those obstacles.
Thank you so much, Duncan, for kind of explaining that context of food security. And I guess we all got a slight insight into that during COVID, when there were certain disruptions in the maze, in the kind of, I guess, the chaos it caused, not just in terms of our shopping habits, but also I think the people's feeling of, I guess, the kind of sense of society unraveling and what that meant for people's well-being, I think at the time was a really interesting experiment. It's interesting because I think the challenge of food security is often one that gets given to rewilding projects. Well, why are you taking land out of food production, and what about the issue of food security? But I guess I wanted to connect that back into what you were saying about the current farming system and this sort of specialised, often, particularly in our area, sort of pasture-based systems. And I suppose if you could elaborate a bit more on what are some of the kind of environmental impacts of that current way of farming, and how is that problematic for our relationship to nature?
It's interesting. I think the major environmental impact, I would say, it's not so much in the farming itself around here. We're not into big, you've got the chicken factories, you've got that issue, but that's a very particular issue, and come back to that. But basically, it's not that the kind of farming around here is wrecking the environment, apart from the water pollution, which is a big issue. Also, there is nature depletion. But the really big impact is the carbon impact of the food we eat and the food that the animals here eat, because that is grown in places where there were rainforests, for example. So there's major felling of rainforests in South America, for example, to produce the food to feed to our animals. The National Park did a carbon analysis of our impact. And in the National Park, the biggest source of carbon that generated by residents is the food they eat. The carbon isn't generated here, it's generated somewhere else, which doesn't make any difference in terms of global. It doesn't matter where it's produced, it's the same world. So really, for me, the major contribution in the long term is to provide people with a different source of food, which is not generating those impacts in other places in the world. Does that make sense? So if we eat more locally grown fruit and veg by agroecological means, we're massively reducing the carbon impact of what we eat.
So just to check my understanding, and there's something about how the farming system as it currently is relying a lot on food that's grown in places that the impact of that growing that food has been a increase in carbon. Whereas if we're going to make choices that are more locally based and we're eating more fruit and vegetable, I guess, as opposed to meat in that source, we're going to be reducing our carbon impact through that choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not only that, from what you said, Duncan, it's significantly increasing productivity acre on acre compared to the way it's currently being done.
We don't think it's that helpful to advocate people eat less meat, because it's quite an alienating thing to say in a rural area, which is, has this history. The fact is that the opportunity The future market opportunity for farmers is fruit and vegetables. That's the growth area. And you can just pursue it on a commercial basis. You don't have to be ideological about it. That's the growth area. If you want to make money in farming, look in that direction and start responding to the increasing demand for that sort of thing. The food security argument, the localization, big cities like we're talking a lot to Birmingham at the moment. They really want food, and they want it from anywhere they can get it, within 100 miles, which includes our area. It's a big market opportunity, and this kind of farming is more profitable per acre than traditional farming. The problem is it requires investment and a rearrangement of how land is parcelled out and so on. And there are lots of barriers as to why that just isn't happening automatically. But that it's essentially a market-driven opportunity to move into this kind of farming.
And that makes so much sense, because if the system is saying that's what it needs, then it's going to be an easier journey in that sense, in terms of selling the product and hopefully the kind of enthusiasm to step into that way of farming. I think we should just go back to briefly, because I think probably at some stage we will do a whole episode around the River Usk and Wye and some of the pollution issues within those rivers. But you did mention about some of the chicken farms, and for some of our audience who might not be local to this area, I wonder whether you could just briefly speak to that challenge.
I mean, how is this famous as the world centre for chicken factories? I call them factories because they're not farms, right?
Yeah.
They're not. They're just massive warehouses with an industry going on inside, and they're producing protein, but they're importing masses of feed from around the world, and that process is creating a massive amount of waste. The way it's happened, it's a commercial thing that's happened. There is a demand for chicken meat. So the big multinational companies, Avara in particular, have come along and said to farmers, we will guarantee you an income by buying your chickens. Therefore, you can invest in this business and borrow the money against the future income. That's the model. So they did, because why wouldn't you? Someone comes along and says that. But as I say, the environmental impact of that has been very, very severe, because the sheer overproduction of waste from that process. And it's caused... There's now a big collective court case amongst all the people who are affected down the River Wye, and they're taking the polluters to court, and communities are fighting, and there's a lot of toxicity around. It's caused a whole lot of terrible upset. And the farmers are in a very delicate position because they've borrowed loads of money to build these things. And if the sale stops, they're absolutely stuffed. So it's extremely delicate. But we're learning from that, because we're saying, well, what if we could guarantee a purchase of vegetables?
Very cool.
Create a finance system, a finance facility whereby farmers could borrow money to diversify into vegetables instead. I mean, it's a good model. I mean, financially, it's a great model. And so that's what we're actually doing. We're thinking, well, let's try and replicate that model, but do it for another sector where there is strong and continuing and guaranteed demand in the future.
That's really interesting, Duncan. I hadn't really thought about that farmer's perspective before. It's easy to just blame the big food companies and be like, we just need to get rid of all the chicken factories. But of course, there's someone's livelihood at stake in that. And it's really helpful to think about that model or way of financing. We've used the term agroecological a few times, which might not be familiar to some people. And I also wanted to think about this idea of, what does a 5-acre farm look like? What if you were to step into one of the farms of the future, say, what would we notice, and how much money does it take to set up something like that when you were talking about the financing?
I don't know in your podcast if you could show pictures when you're doing the podcast, but there are some great aerial pictures that we have of a local farm that's very typical. They're generally quite pretty, lots of little strips of growing with a couple of polytunnels in the middle of it. But agroecological, basically, it's a broad term. It doesn't have a technical definition, but the characteristics of it are completely straightforward. No chemicals used at all, and they often use no-dig processes, which I think everyone's familiar with. You lay down the compost, you buy in compost, you lay it down, plant into the compost, and whenever you harvest, you leave everything under the soil in the soil. You don't ever pull anything out, unless it's a carrot, where you're actually eating the root. But if it's not, you leave it underneath. And what that does is it gradually grows down from the compost into the soil underneath and starts to build the soil down. That makes sense. The soil is being built down as you grow the top. But as important to that is the business model. So there's a whole world of how do you farm efficiently and ergonomically. And these farms make money if you are absolutely committed to every kind of efficiency you possibly can. And I'll give you one tiny little example. All the beds on these farms are the same size, and all the tools are designed for those beds, which means that if you want to rake it, you walk up once and you rake it once. You don't do it twice. Does that make sense? So everything is designed, the way the farm is laid out and where you grow things, to minimize the amount of time you'll take walking from one place in the farm.
Yep.
These are really important things, because magnified over the year, day in, day out, these are the difference between productivity and not productivity. So they look charming and everything, but they are planned with so much precision and science. But you wouldn't see that unless you knew exactly what was going underneath the bonnet. All the machinery, amazing. It's all hand-operated machinery, but my goodness, it's sophisticated. The seeding machines are really state-of-the-art. So basically, that's how you make vegetable growing commercially viable. You're running a business. You really are running a business that's all about margins.
That's great. And we can't put pictures, sadly, at the moment for this podcast. So what we will do is probably create a blog article on the website, or maybe Duncan, you and I can work together on getting something, and we can link to it on there, because I have seen the pictures, and picture does paint 1,000 words. I think now is a great time to move across into your flagship project. I know there's a lot of blood, sweat and tears that have gone before, but I think let's move into this flagship project, because it really will elaborate on what you've just described, because it's not a case of having isolated farms doing 5 to 7 acres worth of farming. You have to work on economies of scales when it comes to building multiple farms as well. So could you please elaborate on that?
Well, I'll tell you about the pilot project that we're doing, and then I'll tell you what we're doing around it.
Cool.
So the pilot project is with Powys County Council. Now, Powys County Council unusually has a lot of land that they own. And they own 134 farms, and they rent those out. We are working with them now to take 38 acres of land that has no farms on it. It's used for pasture at the moment, and turn it into 3 small farms, each with a home. The homes are together. The layout is dictated by the terrain and the water flows and flooding risks and all the rest of it. But in this case, the 3 homes are together. Adjacent to that, there are work facilities, and then each farm has access to a chunk of land. There may be other land on the site that can be shared between them, but that's still in the planning. And the idea is that, to start with, the farmers have to rent, because the way the planning works is you can have a house temporarily for 5 years. If you can prove it works, then you can have it permanently.
Yeah.
So the model is that the farmers would come on and rent for 5 years, but after that we would want them to be able to sell them a lease, like 100 years plus. You know, there may be legal changes, and we could have more Scottish models where you can sell them the property and they can have it for multi-generationally. You don't have that in Wales yet. So that's the model. The first step was to get the planning permission. To get the planning permission, we had to change planning rules. So that took 2 years. So for the last 2 years, we've been working with the council, and they've just published new planning guidelines. That's what they call this. We haven't changed the rules, haven't changed the law, just changed the interpretation of the law in Powys. But that makes a huge difference. So the planning application's in. We're testing it to see whether the change really works, but it looks pretty positive. And we're raising the capital to build the farms. We hope that the first farmers will be there by spring of next year. So that's basically the pilot. But obviously, one pilot isn't enough, and it's not. And a lot of projects just end up being one pilot, and it just isn't. That's just not what we're about. So we're planning scale up. Now, for scale up, we have to do 2 things. The first is we have to create a good environment for farms. Now, we're doing that by building new routes to market, hence the conversation with Birmingham. Powys County Council is buying more and more food for its schools from local farmers. It's a big project. It's growing rapidly. Big step forward next year when a whole load more schools start buying locally. So we're building up the markets. We're building up, we've got massive political support, obviously, from the council and from the local communities and so on and so forth. We want to make Powys a place where farmers go, I want to be there. But the most important thing is access to market. If you start building more and more farms, if you can't provide a bottomless market, you create a meltdown.
Yeah.
Hence our interest in Birmingham, because it is so big. The other thing, though, is that the project as constituted is not scalable, because it's mainly grant funded. And if you're going to be scalable, it can't be grant funded. I mean, we can get away with it for one pilot, but you can't do it again. And so we're sort of starting to develop a finance facility which allows us to buy land, construct farms, rent them for 5 years, and then sell a long-term lease, get the finance back, recycle, start again. So that, which is a very complex process, we're right in the middle of designing it and talking to all sorts of investor people. But it's coming together, and there is experience in this. I mean, nothing we're doing hasn't been done before somewhere.
From a previous conversation we discussed, the reason why this works is because you're not buying a pre-existing farm with X acreage and then splitting it up. You are quite literally just buying the 30 acres, and that's fairly affordable, and then splitting that up and building a new build on top of it, which is eminently more economically affordable, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah. When we get to the point where we're buying, there will be times when there is a farm with a big farmhouse on it. But what we would do in that circumstance is take the farm, create it as a home, put some land around it, enough land for it to be viable and everything, and then sell it off and get a load of money for it, and then work with the remaining land. So that's what we would do. And if you do that, you do increase the value of that plot. 5 acres of bare land is worth less than 5 acres with a small farm on it, even if the small farm is restricted to only ever being able to be used as a farm. So that we'll put covenants on it, so you can't use it as an Airbnb. It's got to stick with farming, because otherwise, I mean, if it's an Airbnb, it'll make more money than farming. End of. But that then undermines food security. So we've got to protect food security by protecting that. But even then, with that restriction on it, it's still, there's a big planning gain, a big sort of investment gain. And that's the basic commercial underpinning of the whole operation.
I'm really struck by for want of a better phrase, the systemic investment in this approach, because you've had to have buy-in from lots of different stakeholders, from the council in terms of their flexibility around the planning, I guess from the schools in terms of their willingness to experiment with other sources of procurement that aren't, my understanding is a lot of Welsh schools buy through big corporates that do a lot of the hassle for them, and then it's so that kind of willingness to experiment with that different way of being, and the grant funders to support it all. So it's fantastic that there is that kind of level of investment. And I suppose, to play a bit of a devil's advocate, I'm holding George Monbiot in my head, who has a bit of a downer sometimes on smaller scale farming of the sort of type you're describing, saying that it's not going to feed the world, and we're all being a bit idealistic and a bit nostalgic to imagine that this approach is going to be the solution to food security. And I suppose I wonder whether you had any particular kind of response to that.
I mean, I wrote to George Monbiot after he wrote the book, and I said, okay, these protein factories that he's describing, can you invent a small-scale version that, like these chicken factories, could operate owned by local farmers, not owned by corporate giants? Because I think he's got a point. And why not have these? But if it's owned centrally, it's not secure, is it? It's the point. The decentralized systems are absolutely critical. If you can make that technology and patent it in such a way that it can be decentralized and owned locally, it's a really good opportunity for these farms to have a building where you're doing that sort of farming. I was quite convinced by the argument. As I say, the only thing is, if, I don't know, Monsanto owns the entire world's protein factory production, then we're done for, basically.
It sounds like you're of a similar mind to Tom and I, which is it's about a diversity of solutions. So there's got to be small-scale farming of the type you're describing, and then that might be quite what might feel like quite an industrial process of protein production. But if it's, I guess, sourced with a sustainable energy supply, and it's in a decentralized way, and it's part of a local food system, then that can still play a role, because we're still going to need large amounts of protein to feed urban areas like Birmingham or Cardiff.
Correct. And I think the key thing that we're trying to do is build ownership locally. So we want the farmers to obviously own the farm, that's one thing, but also own the supply chain. Mm-hmm. If you're selling into a massive corporate structure, which is what farmers do at the moment, they get fleeced. Yeah. And the reason they're making so little money is because they're selling to an enormously powerful interest that can push the price down. And that's what they do. And there's a sort of irony that, therefore they need subsidies. So effectively, what's happening is that the government is giving subsidies to farmers, and they're just giving them to the supermarkets. And if they give them more subsidies, the supermarkets will just push the price down further. And the farmers will never, until they own things, they will never make any money. So in this case, with the protein production, if there is a way that the technology could be licensed so that people could say, well, I'll invest in one of these things, but I own it and I sell, then it would work. But if they can't do that, well, what's happening in the chicken factories is that the money that they're being lent is being lent by the corporates who are buying the stuff, so that the corporates have complete control of them. They lent them the money and they guaranteed them the income. So the farmer is totally in control of the corporate. It can't be like that either. But so that's basically, I would say, why not?
So given Tom's got a load of military references already into the conversation, I feel I should bring in some sort of connection with psychology. And I guess just thinking about us on a personal level. So we get our fruit and veg as part of a subscription scheme from a farm that's it's called Orchard Acre, and it's about 1.5 acres, and it's maybe 10 minutes drive from here. And the lovely thing is there is a benefit for us, not just in terms of getting this amazing, nutritious source of vegetables that's seasonal and grown organically, but we also get to have lovely chats with Alice about the veg they're growing, and it starts to create a sense of connection with the community that I think is also not something that can't be underestimated in terms of the kind of well-being benefits of that. And I wonder whether you had anything to add on to that reflection.
100%. One of the sad things when farmers sell everything that they grow outside of the region is that we don't meet them if we live here. We just don't, because we buy our food in the supermarkets and they sell their food to the supermarkets. So we don't meet. And when you create these local markets, you meet people. It's so basic. And you buy from exactly your experience. I have exactly the same experience. You buy from people you know.
Yep.
And you follow them on Facebook. You connect with them. And there is a policy in Wales to encourage it. It's called the foundational economy, which is where people are buying and selling from each other within a local economy, but they're socialising, they're interacting, and they're belonging. And I think it's absolutely fundamental to the well-being of a rural community that people trade with each other. And so one of the part of our dream is that people who live in the towns and the farmers just know each other much more than they do, and are friends with each other and look out for each other. And we saw a bit of that during COVID, didn't we?
Yep.
A massive outbreak of people looking out for each other.
Yep.
It was amazing. There is that massive potential in our communities to do that. And it's a big strength, but it's underutilized at the moment because of this food system is imposed on us. And we basically, everything we grow, we send out, and everything we eat, we buy in. So we're atomized.
Definitely. And just elaborating on both your 2 points there. Now, I know, Alice, I've been there. I've seen the organic growing that's going on there. I've also met her daughter, who's going to the same school that our daughter goes to, and suddenly you've got those additional connections, and they know other people that we know, and I've offered support to them if they want it. My areas of specialism, and that's the way it hopefully should be, and that's the way we certainly are trying, and sounds like you guys are trying to push towards. Right, looking like we're coming to the end of the conversation. It's been brilliant. It's been really one of those that's just cantered through, and it's been fascinating conversations throughout. My last question, because I know there will be people listening, and I can just think of 4 or 5 off the top of my head of people that I know that have been to the community days, are thinking this is exactly what I've been looking for. So is there a way that people can, or a place that people can go to register their interest? Is there a screening criteria, and what are the timeframes involved?
Well, first of all, we've got a website, ourfood1200.wales. Anyone that goes there, they can subscribe to a newsletter, and we basically tell people of significant events. Be patient, because sometimes not much happens for a while, because we're building something big, and that means we're building it slow. It will suddenly get very exciting, but there's a foundation that we're building at the moment. But the opportunity of those particular 3 farms that is presented there, and people can apply. There's a process, a procedure for applying for those farms. And that's going on now, basically, during this month and next month. That's August and September. I think, as I say, as things grow, we'll organise events and gatherings and things like that. But we're not doing that. We're doing it slowly in line with our actual achievement, as opposed to the big plans we have. That makes sense.
Oh, yeah, it does. And it's just, I love the fact that you and your organisation and the other founders and members of the team are just thinking so strategically, and it's just so nice to hear, because that's not enough people do that. And all the links you just mentioned will be in the show notes as well. So that's it for another episode. Duncan, thank you very much for your eloquence, your experience, your passion for what you're trying to do. And I'm very, very excited to watch what you guys are doing over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. It's going to be great.
Thank you. Pleasure.
What's particularly clever about the mission of Our Food 1200 is the way that a really simple solution addresses so many complex problems.
Yeah. And what is interesting with it is they're very much a startup mentality. You know, he talked about the original theory that they had about finding that 1,200 acres, market gardeners, and that will solve our kind of food security challenges for the South Wales or whatever the challenge they'll face. And then they realised, okay, this is a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. Let's pivot. How do we solve it in a different way? So I really like that mentality, because it's okay to try something and it not go right. It doesn't mean you're a failure. It means you've learned something really valuable. And then they've now used their knowledge they've gained from that to go, okay, how do we solve it in a different approach? What I do know is they've got some very smart people as part of their team as well.
And it's amazing because something as simple as having 3 to 5 acres set aside for horticulture and decentralised food production solves problems for the environment, because we're growing organic food without the pesticides, herbicides and fertiliser that we know are not good for the planet. We're contributing to the local economy, which is something we need in Wales for sure. We're improving people's well-being because we're creating fantastic, healthy vegetables and fruit, which we know are really important for our physical well-being and our emotional well-being. And then we're promoting fantastic community relationships like we discussed in the podcast. Like, it's just a win on every level.
Yeah, I think it's very important also to balance out that this currently is really theory at the moment. Smart people who have come up with good ideas that have obviously got a lot of data and experience behind them, but still it's theory. And that's why there's a 5-year caveat on the lease that they're going to be giving to these farmers. But I just think it's just really exciting. And I hope and believe that people listening to this, there's going to be some that are going to be Googling RFood 1200 straight away and looking at how they can get involved, because it's that dream. It's the ability to become a farmer, work from the land. Being here has been a bit of a curse, I've got to say, in a really positive way. But before, I didn't realise what I was missing out on being outside. And I spent a lot of my time behind a desk doing my previous business. And now I'm here. I spend most of my time wishing I wasn't sat behind the desk, and then I will spend more time outside than I probably should because I've got other work to be done. And I'm trying to find that balance. And I just think there's so many people who will benefit from getting out from behind that desk and taking the opportunity that RFood 1200 will present, and working extremely hard in all conditions with a lot of stress and pressure, which any job that's worth doing will have that, but also extremely rewarding.
And what's great to see is there are courses coming forward on concepts like regenerative horticulture, like Black Mountains College, which is the local further education college within half an hour of here, is offering some fantastic courses to this end, because it's interesting to see, as you say, what this looks like in practice as opposed to in theory, because are people going to come through with enough of the skills that are required to really make these businesses financially viable as well as on a conceptual level?
Yeah, talking about financial viability, the fact that Duncan and the team are thinking about financial viability beyond I'm going to grow some veg and sell it somewhere on a stall in the middle of a high street. He's like, no, we're going to find proper routes to market, and we're going to support our growers to use those routes to market. So the growers focus on growing, and then this organisation, RFood 1200, will then make sure they're connecting the dots, which I think is just fantastic. And the fact that I assume they're a charity or not for profit, I don't actually know, but they will be one of those two. Therefore, they have the best interests of the people that are part of their community at heart, which is hopefully will be the future.
From the perspective of someone that cooks with vegetables we get from our community supported agriculture scheme down the road, I love the opportunity that presents to cook really seasonally and to kind of challenge myself. Like, I don't know, this week we had a beef tomato. Like, I would not routinely buy a beef tomato from Waitrose or wherever I shop. But actually, that was a real gift because we made an amazing tomato and pesto tart that I wouldn't normally do. And it's just such a joy to eat food that is so fresh, grown so locally, and is so in season. Yeah,
I've got to say, we are in this house very lucky to have you that has that ability to cook with these vegetables and be able to turn what we get into something really special. And I just wonder as well, from my perspective, is there another element of the education? We talk a lot about nature literacy, but is also something that we should be doing better from a cooking perspective at schools or whatever, to allow them to build the confidence around these new seasonal vegetables, so they know when the season comes in from school what they could be doing with it. And the reason why I'm saying school and not older is just because that's the easiest way to influence the future generations, as opposed to trying to catch the current generation when they're too busy trying to pay bills and all the other challenges that come with being a grown-up.
But what's the great thing about RFood 1200 is those foods will be in the schools. Like, if things go well, those contracts will be happening between the growers and the schools. So the kids will be eating seasonally. Hopefully that will be made explicit, but that will be implicit anyway, because that will be what's on their plate. Amazing. Right, should we wrap up for today? I think so. Look, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please just, if you're safe to do so, all we ask is to stop for a second, go on to wherever you're listening to on your platform and just rate and review the podcast.
Every week we get 1 or 2 extra reviews, and firstly, it's really nice just to read what people are finding valuable from the journey that we're doing. Also, it makes a difference to where we rank, and therefore whether or not people see this podcast and whether or not they listen to it and want to spend their time listening to it. And hopefully, if you're getting value from it, other people can. So do think about doing that for us. Other than that, have a great couple of weeks. Can't wait to give you an update in 2 weeks' time. Till then, goodbye.
Bye, everybody.